May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The war was over. London erupted in celebration. Flags in every window, strangers dancing in the streets, church bells ringing for the first time in years. Across the capital, floodlights swept the sky not to spot bombers, but to announce peace. The world had survived, and one man stood at its center: Winston Churchill. He stepped onto the balcony of the Ministry of Health, cigar in hand, V sign raised high. Below him, hundreds of thousands of people cheered until their voices broke. To them, he was not just a leader. He was Britain itself, the voice that had held them steady through years of terror. "This is your victory," he told the crowd, "for you are the people of Britain." They roared back, "No, it's yours." For a moment, it seemed impossible that such a man could ever fall. He had faced down Hitler, outlasted the Blitz, and carried a weary empire on his back. He was 70 years old, but his spirit seemed carved from iron. To millions, he was immortal. A modern Caesar crowned not with laurels, but with cigar smoke and defiance. And yet, in that same crowd, beneath the cheers and tears, something else stirred, something quiet, almost invisible. People were grateful, yes, but they were also tired. They wanted more than victory. They wanted peace, change, and a better life after years of rationing and ruin. Churchill had won the war, but the people were ready for something else entirely: to win the peace. That day, as he left the cheering crowds and returned to Downing Street, he told his staff, "The nation is happy now." Then, softly, almost to himself, "But they will soon be restless again." He was right. The seeds of his downfall had already been planted, even in victory. The war had made Churchill a legend. But legends, as history often proves, are not easily loved when the dust settles. By 1945, Britain was a nation of ruins and ration books. Millions of families had lost fathers, sons, and homes. Cities lay in rubble. Industry was exhausted, and empire was crumbling at the edges. To rebuild would require more than courage. It would require a new vision, one not forged in war, but in the promise of ordinary life. And that was a vision Churchill could not quite see. He had always been a man of battles and speeches, of grand strategy and high stakes. But post-war Britain was not asking for heroics. It was asking for houses, jobs, health care, for the small mercies that make peace worth living. His mind, still fixed on global dangers, on the Soviet threat, on the fate of empire, found it hard to bend to domestic dreams. Meanwhile, across the aisle, a quieter man was preparing to meet the nation's mood. Clement Attlee, his wartime deputy, the calm, self-effacing leader of the Labour Party. He had served Churchill loyally through the war, rarely raising his voice, never seeking the spotlight. But he understood something vital: that the British people, weary of sacrifice, now wanted equality and security. Attlee spoke of housing for all, free medical care, jobs for returning soldiers, and a welfare system from cradle to grave. To many, it sounded like salvation. To Churchill, it sounded like socialism, the very thing he believed Britain had fought against. Privately, he called the labor program utopian nonsense. Publicly, he mocked Attlee as a modest man with much to be modest about. But behind his bluster, there was unease. Churchill sensed that the tide was turning, not against him as a man, but against the world he represented. The war had made Britain a collective, a nation bound by shared hardship. Now, in peace, that unity was turning into a demand for fairness. And the people who had once followed Churchill through fire were beginning to imagine a future beyond his shadow. In June 1945, Britain prepared for its first general election in 10 years. The war in Europe was won, but in the Pacific it still raged on. For many, the idea of politics, of party lines and leaflets, felt almost indecent after so much suffering. Yet the nation's mood demanded it. The future had to be decided. Churchill's advisers urged him to delay the vote, to ride the wave of his victory longer. But he refused. "We must not fear the judgment of the people," he declared. "If they wish for change, they shall have it." It was a brave statement, and perhaps a fatal one. The campaign began in a strange atmosphere, part celebration, part reckoning. Churchill toured the country, still cheered wherever he went. But the cheers were nostalgic, not persuasive. Crowds came to see the war hero, not to pledge their votes. They loved him, but not necessarily for the next chapter. Labor's message was simple: let us win the peace as we won the war. Their posters showed soldiers returning home to new homes, new jobs, and a new beginning. Churchill's campaign, by contrast, seemed uncertain, caught between gratitude and fear. His most famous speech of the election warned that Labor's program would require a Gestapo to enforce it. The words shocked even his supporters. The man who had united the nation now sounded divisive. Behind the scenes, Churchill's wife, Clementine, tried to warn him. "Winston," she said gently, "you are seen as the defender of the past. The people want the future." He brushed it off with a smile, but her words lingered. On July 5, 1945, Britain went to the polls. For the first time, millions of soldiers serving overseas cast their votes by mail. Men who had fought for a better world, now choosing what kind of world it would be. Ballot boxes filled, and then Britain waited 3 long weeks for the count to be completed. When it finally was, the result would stun the world and break the heart of the man who had saved it. July 26, 1945. The results were in. Labour, 393 seats. Conservatives, 197, a landslide. The greatest political reversal in modern British history. Winston Churchill, the man who had led Britain through its darkest hour, had been defeated by the quiet, self-effacing Clement Attlee. The announcement came while Churchill was still at his country home, Chartwell. He was reading reports from the Potsdam Conference, where the Allies were redrawing the world. A telephone rang. It was his private secretary. The words were simple, but devastating. "It's over, sir. You've lost." For a moment he said nothing. Then he nodded, lit a cigar, and said, "They have every right to kick us out. That's democracy." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the wound. His wife, Clementine, later recalled, "He was deeply hurt, not by anger, but by sadness. He felt discarded." When he returned to Downing Street for the last time as Prime Minister, the staff lined the corridor in silence. Some wept. Churchill shook hands with each of them, saying, "Cheer up, the people have spoken." Outside, a small crowd gathered. No jeers, no protests, only quiet respect. The war hero walked out of the building he had saved, shoulders slightly stooped, hat in hand. He drove through London in silence. The city he had once walked through in flames was peaceful now, rebuilt, hopeful, and moving on. It was his victory, but no longer his to guide. That evening, he dined with Clementine and their daughter Mary. The radio played the news of Attlee's new government. Churchill raised his glass and said softly, "A nation has chosen peace. Let them have it." It was a toast both gracious and heartbreaking. History would remember that day not as the end of his career, but as one of its greatest paradoxes, the moment when victory turned to exile, when the savior of Britain became its rejected champion. In the weeks after the election, Churchill withdrew from public life. He went to Chartwell, his country retreat in Kent, the only place where he could think without interruption. The house was surrounded by gardens he had planted himself, and the sound of fountains and birds replaced the roar of warplanes. But peace, for him, felt empty. Friends and colleagues came to visit, offering consolation. Some urged him to rest, to write his memoirs, to paint. "You have earned your rest, Winston," they said. But rest was never in his nature. "I have nothing left to fight," he confessed one evening. And that is the hardest battle of all. He spent hours walking the garden paths, hands clasped behind his back, cigar glowing faintly in the dusk. Those who saw him said he looked older, as if the election had aged him more than the war. Yet even in disappointment his mind remained alive. He spoke endlessly about history, empire, and destiny, as though trying to remind himself that one defeat could not erase a life's purpose. He also began to paint again. Quiet, meditative landscapes of water lilies and clouds. "When I paint," he told a friend, "I forget everything, even politics." But the wound remained. Beneath the calm, there was heartbreak, not for himself alone, but for the sense that the Britain he had fought for was changing beyond recognition. He would later tell his private secretary, "I have been discarded like an old glove." But then he smiled faintly and added, "Yet one must remember, the glove once held a sword." Churchill had always believed in destiny. Now, stripped of power, he began to see that destiny could wound as easily as it blessed. The world had turned a page, but the man who had written its greatest chapter was not yet ready to close the book. He would bide his time, quietly, stubbornly, waiting for history to call on him once more, and as always, when it did, he would answer. The first months after Churchill's defeat were strangely quiet. For years, his days had begun with telegrams, battle reports, and the weight of the free world pressing on his shoulders. Now, there were no sirens, no war councils, no urgent voices in the corridor, only birdsong and the ticking of clocks at Chartwell. To those who visited, the stillness seemed peaceful, but to Churchill it was torture. He once told Clementine, "I am not built for idleness. A man who has been needed every hour finds it hard to be needed no longer." He paced the house endlessly, dictating letters that had no recipients, giving speeches to his reflection in the mirror. The newspapers still printed his name, Churchill in retirement, the great man at rest. But between the lines, the truth was written. The nation had moved on. Labor's government was building homes, creating the National Health Service, and turning the wartime unity into social reform. Attlee had become the quiet architect of the peace Churchill could not imagine. And yet there was no bitterness in him, only bewilderment. "They deserved change," he admitted to one visitor, "but I did not think they would wish it so soon." It was the lament of a man who understood war perfectly, but peace imperfectly. He tried to lose himself in painting, setting up his easel by the garden pond. The brush replaced the cigar, the palette, the war map. He painted sunsets and still waters, scenes of serenity that eluded him in life. "I find solace in colors," he wrote. "They never betray you." But he also read voraciously Gibbon, Plato, and the history of Rome. He knew that empires rose and fell, that even their saviors were forgotten in time. Still, it hurt to live that truth. Clementine once found him staring out the window in silence. "You're thinking of the war again," she said. He turned slowly and replied, "No, my dear, I'm thinking of the peace." By 1946, Churchill was no longer Prime Minister, but he was still Winston Churchill, and that name carried a gravity the world could not ignore. Invitations poured in from universities, parliaments, and foreign leaders. If Britain would not hear him, perhaps the world still would. That winter, he traveled to the United States. President Truman invited him to speak at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, a quiet town in the American Midwest. The speech would become one of the most famous of his career, and one of the most misunderstood. Standing beneath a banner that read, "The Sinews of Peace," Churchill warned of a new danger rising in Europe. "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic," he declared, "an iron curtain has descended across the continent." The phrase sent shockwaves across the world. The man who had defeated one tyranny was now warning of another. In London, critics called him alarmist, a relic still fighting ghosts of war, but others saw foresight. He had sensed, before almost anyone else, that the world's next struggle would not be fought with bombs, but with ideologies. The Cold War, historians would later note, began with his words. Privately, though, the speech was also a cry of loneliness. He stood on the world stage again, but as an outsider, a prophet, not a leader. He confessed to a friend afterward, "It is strange to be applauded by millions and obeyed by none." Still, it reignited him. He found purpose again in warning, writing, and speaking. If he could no longer command armies, he could still command language, the only army he ever truly controlled. As he sailed home across the Atlantic, he wrote in his journal, "I am no longer at the helm, but I can still shout through the storm." Back in Britain, Churchill took his seat once more as a leader of the opposition. It was a strange role for a man who had once led empires and armies. The benches of Parliament that had once erupted in "Hear, hear," now greeted him with polite applause. But when he rose to speak, the chamber still stilled. His voice, gravelly, commanding, and familiar, carried the authority of history itself. He fought Attlee's government with the same ferocity he had once reserved for Hitler. Yet it was not malice, it was conviction. He warned that Labor's vast social reforms, if unchecked, could bankrupt the nation. "You cannot build paradise," he thundered, "on borrowed money." His words were sharp, but the public no longer feared catastrophe. The war was over. The people wanted comfort, not caution. Still, Churchill remained a symbol, not of policy, but of endurance. Foreign dignitaries visiting London made pilgrimages to his house. Veterans wrote letters thanking him for giving them courage in the darkest times. To them, he was not a politician, but a memory, a living monument to what Britain had been. Yet Churchill could feel the years closing in. He was 71, his hearing fading, his step slower. Sometimes, in the middle of a speech, he lost his place, and the chamber held its breath until he found it again. When he sat down, Attlee would nod respectfully. Their rivalry, once sharp, had mellowed into something closer to mutual understanding. Despite their differences, both men had carried the weight of Britain through crisis, one through war, the other through peace. And Churchill, though he never admitted it publicly, had come to respect Attlee's quiet resolve. A modest man, he once joked, but with much to be modest about. In private, he would add softly, and much to admire. He began to see his own story not as tragedy, but as evolution, the passing of one age to another. "The torch," he wrote to a friend, "must be passed. I only hope it still burns as bright." By 1949, Britain was changing once more. Rationing persisted, but so did fatigue with Labor's austerity. The country had rebuilt, but the glow of reform had faded. Attlee's government, weighed down by strikes and shortages, began to lose its sheen. The people who had wanted change now wanted reassurance again. And reassurance had a familiar face. Churchill felt it too. His party urged him to retire, but he refused. "I am ready for service," he told them, "even if the call is faint." Though his body was frailer, his spirit had rekindled. The country might have outgrown him once, but he sensed history circling back. The 1951 election came quietly, without grandeur or war cries. There were no fireworks, no floodlit crowds, only weary voters choosing between the builder and the bulldog. When the results were announced, the pendulum had swung once more. The Conservatives returned to power, and Churchill, at 76, was Prime Minister again. It was an astonishing comeback. The old warrior returned to the stage. But even as he stood at the dispatch box once more, cigar in hand, there was a difference. The fire was gentler now. He no longer roared. He reflected. His speeches were shorter, his tone softer. The defiance of 1940 had become the wisdom of experience. He focused on healing rather than conquering, on housing, education, and Britain's place in a new nuclear world. "We must now learn," he said, "to make peace our occupation." For the British people, his return was not triumphal, but comforting. The man who had led them through fire now guided them through twilight. It was, in many ways, his curtain call, the closing act of a life that had refused to fade. By the mid-1950s, Churchill's health began to fail. His hands trembled, his memory faltered, and the spark that had once ignited nations flickered low. Yet he clung to his post, unwilling to let go of the work that had defined him. "I am ready to meet my Maker," he once joked, "but I am not sure he is ready to meet me." His colleagues whispered that he was too old, too tired. Even his doctors urged him to rest. But Churchill would not step down until he was sure his country was safe. From war, from division, from the chaos he had seen engulf the world twice in his lifetime. When he finally resigned in 1955, he did so quietly. There was no grand farewell, no final speech to the crowds. He simply walked out of 10 Downing Street the same way he had 10 years earlier, slower, older, but still unbowed. Reporters stood in silence as his car pulled away. It felt like the end of an era, because it was. In his final years, he wrote, painted, and reflected. The war memoirs he published became bestsellers, and through them, he shaped the world's memory of those dark years. "History," he had once said, "will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And he did. But beneath the words lay something deeper, a quiet melancholy that victory and fame could never cure. He had given everything to his country, and in return it had given him immortality and loneliness. "Every man's life," he once wrote, "is a walk with destiny. Mine has been a long road, and it has led me here to the silence." In that silence he found a kind of peace. The man who had roared against tyranny now sat beneath his rose trees, painting clouds reflected in still water. At last, he told Clementine one evening, "The storm is over." She looked at him and replied, "Yes, Winston, and you were our thunder." By the late 1950s, Churchill had become a living monument, revered, but increasingly alone. Younger politicians treated him with awe, not intimacy. Crowds still applauded when he appeared in public, but it was the applause of memory, not momentum. The man who had once commanded armies now commanded nostalgia. At Chartwell, he spent his mornings at his desk, surrounded by books and old speeches. He reread them often, as if trying to measure the distance between the man who wrote them and the man who remained. "The older I get," he said to his secretary, "the more I see that history is written not in triumphs, but in endurance." Visitors came in steady streams, diplomats, journalists, admirers. They expected fire and wit. What they found was something gentler. He asked them about their families, their gardens, their peace. "It is peace that is fragile," he often said. "War, sadly, is the natural condition of man." He still painted, but his colors grew softer. More sky, more water, fewer battlefields. His canvases reflected his mood, a man drifting into reflection, haunted by ghosts of both victory and defeat. Once, while looking at an unfinished painting, he said quietly, "I used to paint storms. Now, only calm." At night, he sometimes took long drives through London, his city. He would pass Westminster, the Thames, and St. Paul's, all still standing as they had when he fought to save them. Few noticed the dark car or the elderly man within. Yet, if they had looked closely, they would have seen him smiling faintly, as though recognizing an old friend who had outlived them both. "London," he whispered once, "you were my greatest battle and my greatest love." As the 1960s dawned, Churchill's world continued to shrink. The empire he had defended was dissolving into independence. India was long gone, Africa was breaking free, and the Union Jack was being lowered across the globe. To some, it was the natural course of history. To Churchill, it was a slow heartbreak. He had believed in empire, not out of greed, but out of faith. He saw it as civilization's backbone, a duty rather than dominion. Watching it fade was like watching his life's work dissolve in slow motion. "I have lived too long," he told a friend. "I have seen too much undone." And yet he bore it with grace. He never turned bitter, never lashed out. Perhaps he understood that every age must end. "The world I knew," he said, "has passed. Let those who come after build their own." It was the first time in his life that he had spoken without command, only acceptance. Younger leaders still sought his counsel. Eisenhower visited, as did de Gaulle. Each found the old man charming, if elusive. "He speaks like an oracle," de Gaulle remarked, but with the sadness of one who no longer believes his own prophecies. When he appeared in Parliament for the last time, the chamber rose in silence. The applause lasted longer than most speeches. Churchill stood, leaning on his cane, and bowed slightly. The speaker later said it was the most moving moment in the House's history, not because of words, but because of everything he had already said. He had been soldier, statesman, writer, painter, prophet, and now, finally, relic. But in that word lay reverence, not dismissal. He had become what few men ever do, a bridge between centuries. And even as he faded, Britain still lived in his shadow, and in his debt. By 1964, Churchill was 90 years old. His body had betrayed him. Strokes had dulled his memory, his speech had slowed, his steps faltered. But behind the clouded eyes the spark still glimmered. Sometimes, when a familiar phrase or melody stirred him, he would straighten up, as if the lion within were stirring once more. He no longer wrote or painted much. Instead, he sat by the window at Chartwell, gazing at the Kent hills. Visitors often found him silent, yet alert, as though he were listening for echoes only he could hear. "He is communing with his ghosts," Clementine once said softly. "And they are many." His family shielded him from politics. He no longer read the papers. The world had changed too much. Space travel, nuclear standoffs, youth movements. The age of telegrams and war councils had become the age of television and protest. "I am glad," he said once, "that I ruled when there were still men who believed in duty." In those final years, he found comfort not in crowds but in small kindnesses, the laughter of grandchildren, the scent of cigars, the sun on the rose garden he had planted himself. His war was over, his battles fought, his words immortal. What remained was peace, the one victory that had eluded him in life, and now, finally, was his. When journalists asked what he wanted to be remembered for, he smiled faintly. "For doing my best when the world was falling apart," he said. "That will do." And perhaps that was all history ever asked of him, to do his best when no one else could, and to bear the burden when no one else dared. January 1965. The news broke quietly. Sir Winston Churchill had died at his London home, aged 90. For a moment it seemed the world itself held its breath. Across Britain, church bells tolled. Flags flew at half-mast. The man who had once been the voice of defiance was silent at last. The government declared a state funeral, the first for a commoner in generations. Queens and presidents came from across the world. In St. Paul's Cathedral, beneath the same dome that had survived the Blitz, they gathered to honor the man who had saved their freedom. As his coffin, draped in the Union Jack, was carried through the streets, the city fell still. Dock workers along the Thames lowered their cranes in salute. Veterans wept openly. Children perched on rooftops to glimpse the passing cortege. It was as though Britain itself, the Britain he had built, saved, and mourned, was saying farewell to its own reflection. At his request, he was buried in the small churchyard of Blaydon, beside his parents. No grand monument, no marble columns, just an English grave under an English sky. "I am ready to meet my Maker," he had once said, "and to account for my life." It was an account few could rival. In the days that followed, newspapers across the world printed the same simple phrase: "He gave us courage." No one needed to explain what it meant. They all knew. For when the lights had gone out in Europe and civilization hung by a thread, one man's voice had kept the flame alive, and though the man was gone, that flame, his words, his example, his defiance, burned still. Time, as Churchill himself had predicted, was kind to him. Historians debated his policies, his prejudices, his politics, but none could deny his greatness. He was flawed, yes, vain, impulsive, imperious, but he had met history's greatest trial and not faltered. "Cometh the hour, cometh the man," they said. And in that hour he had come. Modern Britain outgrew him, yet never escaped his shadow. His voice still echoed through classrooms, parliaments, and films, the cadence of courage itself. The nation that once turned him out of office now carved his likeness in bronze, his words in stone. That was his final victory. To be remembered not for losing power, but for giving people hope. But the deeper truth of his life was simpler, that greatness and loss are inseparable. The same strength that won the war made him ill-suited for peace. The same certainty that inspired a nation blinded him to change. He was both savior and relic, and therein lay his tragedy. In his memoirs, he once wrote, "Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." Those words were not just advice, they were confession. He had lived them, every step, every setback, every speech. And so, when history looks back at Churchill, the man who won the war but lost the peace, it sees not contradiction, but completion. For no man, however mighty, owns his era. He merely carries the torch until time demands it from his hands. The torch he carried still burns, in London's skyline, in the echoes of his speeches, in the stubborn resilience of every generation that refuses to surrender. He lost the election, but he never lost the people. For when Britain stands against the dark, it still speaks with his voice, the voice that once said, in the hour of ruin and glory alike, "We shall never surrender."